Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Chris Jennings.
Joining me today is John Pullman, Ducks Unlimited magazine contributor, a freelance writer. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Glad to be with you.
Now, I bring John on, on occasion, and he and I go back and forth on decoy spreads. John's quite the tactician as far as decoys and calling and things like that. He really puts a lot of thought into it. And John has written a piece. I don't know, this was probably a few years back, but this ended up being a column in the mixed bag section. And surprisingly, this column was one of the highest rated columns in the magazine, I think in 2017. But the piece is called Weather Driven Decoy Tactics, and it's 5 strategies and when to use them in different weather situations. John, how did you kind of come up with this idea just, off the top of your head as far as, providing a different look and a different feel to creating a decoy spread based on the weather conditions?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the weather is that one big factor in duck hunting, goose hunting that it's out of our control. As hunters, we're looking at our smartphones in the morning for temperature and for wind direction, for all those things. But there's not much, there's nothing that we can do to control the weather. But what we can do is control our response to it. And the best waterfowl hunters that I know, they don't go out and do the same thing every day. When they respond to bird behavior, obviously they respond to hunting pressure and things like that, but they also respond to the weather. And so what I did is I picked 5 guys that I know that have been hunting a long time, and I picked their brains in terms of give me a weather situation that is frustrating, and then give me how you respond to it. And I think I came up with 5 pretty good little bits of information about how these duck hunters make the best of the situation, respond to that weather, and still put birds on the strap.
Yeah, that's the reality. We talk about all these decoy spreads and doing this and doing that, but you're at the mercy of weather in so many every single day. I mean, that can change. You could lay in bed at night and come up with this fantastic decoy strategy and wake up in the morning and something weather-wise is drastically wrong with your great idea. I do that all the time. But, the first one that you have is probably the waterfowl hunter's, arch rival, which is no wind. And you kind of label that as no wind, no worries. Explain how, and you used Ben Fouillon, who's, a good friend of yours up there in South Dakota. Kind of explain his strategy for going into a morning with no wind.
Absolutely. Benny hunts from Canada down to Arkansas. I mean, he spends a lot of time in the field each fall, and this is something that he runs into a lot, and it's like you say, it's probably your worst nightmare when you wake up in the morning. You could be on the X. You could be have an absolute money spot lined up for the morning. And then you wake up and the wind is dead. And it is, when you don't have wind, you don't have a way to give those birds a direction. You can't anticipate what they are going to do. It's a really frustrating scenario. And I think for Ben, the part that's hard for him, and he hunts out of A-frame blinds and layout blinds, but this is something too that you could use if you're in a permanent blind situation. He wants to keep that bird movement out in front of him so that he can see what they are doing. Because on a morning with no wind, those birds can be working behind you. They can be trying to land behind the blind. They can be landing off to your sides. So what he does is he puts everything out in front of the blind. All the decoys, maybe a handful behind the blind just to kind of break up the outline, but he keeps everything out in front for the sole fact that then he can keep tabs on the birds, watch what they're doing, watch the reaction. And then when they provide a shot, he can take it. He's not second guessing. He's not wondering if they're, if the birds are working behind, if he needs to have to try to let them swing one more time, whatever it may be. It gives him a little more control over making the shot, seeing what those birds are doing. And like I say, he pushes everything out in front of his blinds. decoys, motion decoys, he pushes those out maybe a little bit further away than normal. Typically you may want your spinning wing decoy. If you're in a field hunting situation, you may want those just 10, 15 yards off of the boot bags of your blind or out in front of your A-frame. He'll push those out a little bit further, again, to use that motion in a way to keep those birds out in front of him, and to be able, so that they're not trying to work right on top of the blind, so to speak. And so, like I say, everything gets pushed out away in front of the blind. And I've been with Ben on hunts like this, and it works. I mean, it's something where, if there's, my biggest takeaway from it is that as a hunter, I want to be able to see those birds as much as possible. And this setup does it. They're not working behind the blind. They're not working off to the sides. It keeps their motion out in front of you so that you can make the best decision when it comes time to make the shot.
Yeah. And a lot of that is, you're trying to control the shot more than that the ducks are going to do probably some weird things and try and sneak in on the backside of the blinds, or they don't have to follow those typical rules that we talk about where ducks are landing into the wind, with no wind. I mean, they can really come from any angle, and I think what it sounds like he's trying to do here is more or less control his visual and his shot, and making that the priority rather than being able to control how the birds are going to approach.
It gives you a little bit of control over the situation, because like you say, when there's no wind, those birds can do whatever they want to do. I mean, they can come from any direction. They can try to finish from any direction, and by keeping that their motion and their keeping things out in front, it gives you a little bit more of a choice in terms of when to call a shot and when to let them maybe try to swing again. And it's the only way, in my mind, when there's no wind, it's the only way to hunt.
The next one that you put on here, and this is probably much more familiar for hunters up north, when it gets really cold, when that temperature really drops, there's snow on the ground. You're talking probably some late season, super cold hunts. The gentleman that you interviewed from Pennsylvania, he had a couple of different situations and scenarios that where he kind of brought to the point that he's really trying to focus on what these live birds are doing and trying to replicate that with his decoy spreads. Can you kind of talk about this one and why this shells in the cold is it's really a unique strategy?
Kevin Eddy's out in Pennsylvania and does a lot of late season hunting for Canada geese out there. And in Pennsylvania, northern tier state, any place where you're dealing with cold and ice and snow, this would be an effective tactic for you. And he really tries to imitate what those birds do in that cold weather situation. And so when you watch these geese, when they hit the ground, they tend to lay down, and Kevin thinks it's maybe thaw the snow down but underneath them a little bit, and makes it a little bit easier to be able to reach the food underneath. Whatever the reason may be, that's what they tend to do. They in a snow covered field, they're going to hit the ground, they're going to lay down, and so he tends to use a lot of shell decoys for that reason. Again, to mimic what they are doing in a realistic situation. And this is something that a lot of people that I talk to, here in South Dakota, we have the Missouri River. Pierre, South Dakota is a great spot for late season Canada goose hunting. And those hunters out there do the very exact same thing. When it's cold and there's snow on the ground, they're going to be using a lot of sleeper shells because that's what the birds are doing. And Kevin's other little tactic that he does is that he will mix in full bodies within that decoy spread, again, to make it look like a bird that's maybe getting up, it's stretching, and you add motion with the flag, you can really, really make that a realistic situation. But adding those full bodies within those shell decoys to give the perception of birds that are up, moving around, that maybe have been there for a little bit longer and that are moving around to look for food. And so the combination of those two, majority shell decoys, mix in some Walker style full bodies, or maybe even some sentry decoys with their heads up nice and tall to give some visibility as well. And that seems to be a really good 1-2 combination for him.
Yeah. And, that kind of goes back. We've talked about this before in your scouting kind of, the pre-hunt approach. If you're driving around and it's these cold, snowy days, it's probably in most hunters' best interest to check out and see what these birds are doing. Are they laying down in the fields? Are they standing up?
Mhm.
And then mimic that. And that sounds exactly what Kevin appears to be doing here, with mimicking what the birds in his local area are doing. If they're hitting the ground and they're immediately laying down to maybe thaw that snow or for whatever reason, that's exactly how you want to approach it. And that's when you start adding in the shells and the sleepers and things like that. So it goes back to, the importance of scouting once again.
Absolutely, that's a huge component of being a successful waterfowl hunter. Scouting, it takes a lot of time. It can be frustrating at times, but when you put that effort in, more times than not, it's going to pay off in the long run.
And for the next one, you reached out to a gentleman in Oklahoma, and Oklahoma has kind of become a little bit of a bright spot for waterfowl hunters the last few years. I know several guys who go out there a lot now, and with this spread, it's targeting ducks, but they're using geese. Can you kind of explain how and why this hunter takes this approach?
So I talked to Dallas Branch once in northern Oklahoma, and in terms of a weather situation for this spread, this is something that he uses when really the weather has gone stale. And I mean, just like waking up and having no wind in your decoys, a stale pattern of weather, mild temperatures, very little precipitation, birds just get to be really hard to hunt. And so what he does during that situation where you're kind of maybe it's a mid-season blue, or you've had birds have been there a while, or like I say, the weather has just gone stale, he mixes it up, and he does that by incorporating Canada goose decoys into his spreads for mallards. And it adds visibility. It adds a sense of confidence. Mallards love to be around geese. It seems like they'll land when you've got a group of Canada geese and ducks on the ground. They're going to land right on that edge between the two. And it's, again, kind of go back to what you said before, based on your observations of these birds, use that to your advantage. And like I say, his adding Canada goose decoys into his spread, it freshens it up a little bit. It makes it look different than what everybody else is doing. And when you're in a period of time where the weather's been stale or the birds have gone stale for whatever reason, mixing it up like this is one way to give them something new to look at. And hopefully that'll be the difference between having them fly on by and actually decoying and coming in the pocket and giving you a shot.
Yeah, no, it's a great, like you said, it adds confidence. And I think, just speaking as far as even this season, I think hunters throughout, the Mississippi Flyway and the Central Flyway, and even the Pacific Flyway have dealt with their fair share of stale weather conditions. We're definitely dealing with that right now in the Mississippi Flyway. And this is something that, hunters can look at it maybe completely outside the box of what they're accustomed to doing as far as using these, Canada goose floaters, and really targeting ducks. So, it's something for people to look at, with these stale conditions, kind of like what Dallas was explaining in the piece, is the conditions are so poor that, you may have to try something you've never tried before. And this is something for people to look at, and it can change the outcome. Like you said, mallards, they really dig getting in there with the geese, and they're not afraid to do it. So, definitely something for hunters to look at. Number 4 you had was you referred to this as raising the stakes, and you used Ben Cade, a Minnesota waterfowler who targets a lot of, I guess I would consider, almost, urban geese, around the metropolitan areas near his house. And this is a pretty cool approach, but kind of explain what he was referring to as raising the stakes.
So Ben does a lot of Canada goose hunting, like you said, central Minnesota metro area. These birds get to be pressured, and a lot of times that drives them into different kinds of field situations where there may not be. I personally think, and I think Ben would agree, that these birds start to maybe target fields where there isn't a lot of cover. There aren't places to hide because they feel safer there. And so these birds are hitting these fields where there is absolutely zero cover. It's here in South Dakota and Minnesota as well, and other places it could be just like a chiseled cornfield or a chiseled bean field where farmers come in after harvest and put the plow to the ground and chisel that ground up to prep it for planting the next spring. And there is not a stitch of vertical cover to be found. And so it's in cases like this where there is no other place to hide the blind, there's no fence line, there's no other depression in the field where you either have to hunt that field or go find something else. What he does, or what he has done, is created some extra long decoy stakes that he will use for decoys that will be placed around layout blinds. And it gives the appearance then of these birds almost being on top of the blind. It kind of creates a depth perception that the blind is ground level and that those birds are walking across your blinds. And so it's something that has been effective for him. I know it is something that hunters have done in the spring with snow geese as well. Putting those blinds, if you're hunting with 8 or 9 or 10 guys, putting those layout blinds shoulder to shoulder, and then having some extra long decoy stakes to place around those blinds, full bodies on those extra long stakes, again, to create that perception that ground is, that area is flat, that those birds are maybe feeding up against an area of maybe a little taller stubble or whatever it may be. But again, it's all about erasing the profile of those layout blinds on the ground which is something that, I think flares a lot of birds. The layout blinds can be really successful. It can be really effective, but their profile can still be an issue at times. And so this is one way that Ben does it to kind of get rid of that profile and create this perception that those birds are feeding on the ground.
We've talked about that a lot, just even between you and I, that being able to hide those blinds, especially with conditions varying and hunting metropolitan birds where there's probably a lot of pressure on these birds.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to be right in that field where, like you said, there's no cover, limited availability to be able to hide.
Mm-hmm.
You create this illusion, and I think the bird's perception of that. Once you do it a few times, you realize that they don't even notice that those things are on 3.5 foot stakes versus 18-inch stakes. I mean, we notice it because we take great detail in our decoy spreads, but I think the birds, they don't notice that as far as, the depth perception of the spread and how it looks, but it really does hide those blinds.
Absolutely. And to make the weather connection here and talking with Ben, again, this is another spread, another idea that he uses primarily when conditions are stale. Birds that have been there a while, that the weather is weather has a way of making birds forget about a lot of their defense mechanisms. When it's cold or snow or whatever it may be, they want to get out there and feed, and they're not so wary. So this is something that he will, a tactic that he will use. If birds been around a while, they're getting kind of stale, the weather's not helping him out any, and he has no other choice but to hunt this field where there's not a lot of cover. And maybe it's a field that other hunters aren't even trying to hunt because there is no cover. And this is one way to get at these birds that are being kind of difficult.
The next one that you did, it comes out of Nebraska, and Doug Stanky, he hunts. Yeah, I'm sure most of our audience is probably familiar with a lot of his work on the photography side for sure. It's called Stand Out in the Crowd. And it's really, once it gets into that really cold time of year, late season, rivers are starting to freeze up a little bit. Kind of explain how Doug approaches his late season spread.
Yep, this is a cold water spread. This is last open water, late season. There's ice on the river, ice on the edges of the river. Potholes are frozen up. Birds want to be where there's open water. They're reluctant to get out. So you're talking late season mallards, and this is a spread where, when you look at birds this time of year, and it kind of goes back to what we mentioned before about using shell decoys for honkers, that when you look at mallards on these rivers this time of year, a lot of those birds are up on the sandbars, heads tucked down, and they are up and out of the water, try to get some warmth. And he will use full body mallard decoys then. And I think he says in the article, he says he uses 6 full bodies for every floater that he has on the water. And so it's, again, just to give that perception of these birds that have landed, that have crawled up onto the sandbar to catch some sun, maybe warm up in the afternoon. And again, it's mimicking what he is seeing in real life. And again, that's just such an important lesson for waterfowl hunters to learn that, when you have to err on the side of anything, do what the ducks are doing. They're showing you what they want. They're showing you, their habits. Mimic that as much as you can with your decoy spreads. And I've never hunted Nebraska, but in my mind, this is the situation I want to hunt. I want to do this late season, just because it sounds like so much fun to be able to hunt these birds in that cold weather. And Doug has figured out a way to do it pretty well.
Yeah, and I have hunted Nebraska, but it wasn't in this situation, unfortunately, and it does, like you said, it sounds like the perfect scenario. Cold, things are starting to freeze up. The birds are kind of being forced to make decisions that they may not want to do. And what you're trying to do is create what would appear to be the safest place for these birds, and really provide that little haven for them to dip into on some of these small flowing rivers. And one thing that Doug points out in the piece as well is that he's using black ducks.
Mm-hmm.
That's not very not common at all there in Nebraska, but he's using them for a different reason. And it's a lot of that visibility. And we've talked about that before with everything, using the Canada goose decoys as a higher visibility for mallards, but he's using black ducks. And kind of what's your opinion on that, as far as tying in these black ducks to create that larger, I guess it would be a larger contrast within the spread.
Sure. And I think Doug he's been using, I've seen some of his really old photos, and you will see in the photos where he has actually painted mallard decoys black. Before there were, commercially available black duck decoys, it was something that he had latched onto a long time ago. This idea that, by adding that really dark decoy in the mix, it helps things stand out, and it just creates another layer of visibility for the birds that are passing by. And if you think about it, folks that hunt out on this Great Salt Lake, that put out hundreds of these black silhouettes on the water, and it's all about visibility. It's all about getting the attention of the birds as they're passing by. And so Doug latched onto that a long time ago. He figured out by adding some sort of a dark decoy, a different shade, it's going to create a contrast with everything else that you have out in the water. And obviously he's not using a complete set of black duck decoys, but he's adding just enough of them, I think, to create that contrast, give another layer of visibility for birds that are passing by. And that's a tactic that I use here in South Dakota as well.
I know several guys that do it. Kelly Powers down here at Tennessee and Western Kentucky. He's doing that as well. I've done a couple different pieces where I interviewed him where he talks about spreading these decoys 200 and 300 yards out along a levee or the edge of a river, and he's implementing large numbers of black ducks just for that reason. It seems to be becoming a little more common, and black duck decoys are more readily available these days.
Yeah, I can guarantee. I don't think Doug is. If he's shot I'm going to go out on a limb and say I don't think he's probably ever shot a black duck in western Nebraska. My luck is that he probably has, because the guy's been duck hunting a long time. But again, it's about thinking outside the box, trying something different, and finding a way to create some more visibility for your decoys. And more and more people are doing it, and they're doing it because it works.
We've hinted on it a little bit, but all of these tactics are completely based on what people are seeing these birds actually do. And, everything from the geese laying down to the Canada geese or mallards kind of heading into the Canada goose decoys as almost like a confidence decoy. But everything it really involves keeping an eye out on the birds, staying vigilant as far as scouting.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk to some of these guys, is that what they're really keying in on? I know we've stressed on it, but is that what they're all saying?
Yeah, absolutely. It's all based on their observations, not only from scouting and seeing what the birds are doing, but from spending days in the blind and in the field. watching how birds react to different things. And, every one of these guys has an inventive mindset in a way. And I'll look at, the first one we talked about today, Ben Fuyan, is just a really good friend. And I know Ben really well. He is not afraid to just try something different. If they are not reacting to what you're putting out there, don't sit there, do something different. And he may not necessarily do it that day, but he'll try it the next day. And then he'll try something different the next day, just to try to stay successful on a consistent basis. And, every one of these duck hunters that I talk to, they love to put birds in your face. They love to put birds on, in the pocket and in the hole. And so they want to do that day after day. And one of the ways they're doing that is to change things up, think outside the box, do something different, and then watch how the birds react to it. And if it's not the way that you want, change something else. Don't be afraid to change.
There's a reason why, these aren't exact numbers or anything, but there's a reason why, 10% of the duck hunters shoot 90% of the ducks that are harvested in North America, because, you've got some of these people who are really spending their time and who have done it, for so long, and they're spending time in the field. They're watching these birds. They're also trying these different tactics, something that, we kind of joke around, you drive around Arkansas and everybody out there has got, 2.5, 3 dozen mallard decoys and 2 spinners out in front of their pit, or, blind or whatever, where everybody's got the same decoy spread, and doing something different, especially when you're being forced to do it based on weather conditions. It really gives you an opportunity to test things out. And like you said, don't be afraid to jump out and change it up and mix it up, and, maybe throw some goose decoys out where you normally wouldn't.
The best duck hunters that I know, and whether they've been hunting for 15 years or for 50 years, they want to learn. They are still curious about these birds. They're curious about how they're going to react to things. And I think that is if there's one lesson that I've learned over my years, is that it's good to have that. It's good to be, an observer as much as a hunter. And, it's the desire to, I love to put mallards on the strap as much as anybody else. And I have discovered that in order to do those things, I can't be afraid to change up my ways and try something different. And like I say, I've been hunting ducks for 30 years, and I guarantee you, I still have a lot to learn about this game. And the only way that you're going to learn is to try something different and do something different in reaction to what the birds are showing you. And it's fun when you see an idea come to fruition where you've got an idea to do this instead of that, and it works. I mean, building confidence as a hunter is great. There's hardly a better feeling in the world.
Yeah, when it all works out on one of your outside the box plans, it really is. It's like the ultimate reward. Now, I will say that I've put together some pretty zany decoy spreads, and I will be the first one to admit that some of them did not work, but some of them have, and that's what that's what keeps me trying to mix it up a little bit. That's about that's most of the fun for me, is mixing it up and trying something different. And you may learn something along the way.
Exactly.
Hey, John, I appreciate you joining me today. It's been a great conversation, and our audience can check out this full article on ducks.org. It's weather-driven decoy tactics. But yeah, I appreciate you joining me. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Anytime.
I'd like to thank my guest, John Pullman, for joining me today and talking about weather-driven decoy tactics. I'd like to thank our producer, Clay Baird, for getting the podcast out to all of you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.